So, so you get crowding out, you get higher taxes. The third reason the multiplier has gone down to this 0.6 from the textbook version of 10 is you also have debt service. To the extent we're increasing the load of government debt relative to our income, we have to service that debt, and we got to pay for it through taxes. And now we're at the point where we have taken an enormous leap, and this would be page not household. Government debt as percentage of GDP. Page 10. Page 10. And this is, by the way, incorrect. This is not, this is GDP. Government debt as percentage of GDP. And this is the ratio of debt to GDP. Take a look in the last recession how far we've leaped. We've leaped from debt to income, and obviously you have to, like any banker, you look at debt to income ratios because you have to service the debt. And we've leaped from about 83% to 102%. And this is like in a year. Now, this has gotten the market's attention, to say the least. Now, by the way, I do have to point out, part of this, they're including something the White House doesn't like to include, and that is the contingent liability of Fannie and Freddie. Since they have gone into conservatorship, that now has become explicit. So I think the CBO is carrying it, but the White House will never talk about that extra $3 trillion in debt. But basically, we have leaped in government debt outstanding in the U.S. Let's say 8 years ago, George Bush was elected, or was it 9 years almost now? Our federal debt was $6.2 trillion. Today we're at 14, and that's nothing compared to what's about to befall us. That's minor. So basically, what we have now is a much smaller multiple. You spend $1, you finance it. You increase debt because that's how we're able to spend this trillion of government debt, is to finance it. And of course, it's a problem where to raise it, which brings the Federal Reserve in a minute. But the implication of the multiplier going down is something else, and that is the marginal debt load goes up. And let me just point that out to you. If you change, the terminology, you spend another $1, you get more GDP. So that's the multiplier. As the multiplier goes down, what actually happens is, even though the multiplier was defined as $1 of government spending and $1 of total income, what actually happens is, since all the government spending is financed by government debt, you have a one-to-one translation of government debt to government spending to government debt. And then you also have a translation of one-to-one for every dollar of traditional, as we used to talk about, change in GDP to change in income. So what's happening is, as the multiplier is going down, the income generated for $1 of debt at the federal level is going down from 10 to 2 to 0.6. And by the way, I really think it's more like 0.2 today. The implication of all this is that the inverse of the multiplier, how much income you generate for $1 of government spending, which you financed, it turns out it's going to take the inverse of it. It raises the debt-to-income ratio, which is what we're looking at over here. So what I'm trying to do is make this translation where if the multiplier goes down, basically you're adding a lot more debt than you're getting income. And it's raising your debt-to-income ratio. You really have to look at the multiplier as a payoff. If the government is spending $1 of debt, spending $1 and financing it and creating debt, and you're only getting back 60 cents of income. Okay? You now have that debt on your books. $1 of debt on your books, and the transitory income coming in at 60 cents to pay that debt or service it. So now look what happens to your ratio of debt to income. Well, if we take the inverse of this, let's see, that's 0.5. So as the multiplier goes down, the marginal contribution of debt to income goes up. Okay? If we're, as Robert Barrow put it, he thought the multiplier based on the last 30 years is 0.6. It means that 1 over 0.6 means that at the margin, with such a poor payoff for government spending, we are adding to debt relative to income to pay it off, and we're adding to debt at the ratio at the margin of 1.66. Well, where are we now? We're at a ratio of 1.02. So even if we do have the same multiplier effect that Barrow cited over the last 30 years, we're still going to be adding to this debt-to-income ratio. Furthermore, it's a lot worse than that. I hope you didn't get comfortable. The reason is, what's happening today is that the government spending and the consumer is retrenching to the point where the offsets to government spending are enormous. What I have in the handout today is one citation from a paragraph from Gary Schilling, which is, I guess, on the fourth page of the text, the third page on the text. It is called Excerpt from Gary Schilling, Insight, July 09. And what's happening is consumers saved 104% of their after-tax income increase, i.e. the rebates, the refunds that went their way, they ended up saving all of it plus some. His conclusion is consumers are saving virtually all the fiscal stimulus. So what's happening is another way of saying the government goes in and spends $1, raises our debt in perpetuity for $1, unless we run a surplus and pay it off, and we got to continue to pay debt service on it. So basically, what we did with the tax rebate is raise this by $1 trillion, and we got zero effect from the consumer. We didn't even get a tiny effect. We used to get like 5 times, 6 times. We got zero because they're trying to deleverage. So basically, the government's making very bad investments. The investment they're making is selling debt that has such a low payoff in income that the debt-to-income ratio rises. Sobering. The thing's getting out of control. In other words, we might be reaching the tipping point where this thing gets out of control. And if Joe Biden's task force on creating employment for the middle class creates more of this, then we're further behind the line. And my guess is the financial markets are going to step up to the plate and say, no, the U.S. has a sovereign risk premium has to be charged in order to be lending to the United States government. Basically, I think we've reached a tipping point. And the tipping point occurs because the multiplier is so small. $1 of debt has such a small payoff in income that the debt-to-income ratio rises. And the only way you could possibly justify more government fiscal policy is if you're investing in capital structure that somehow raises income in perpetuity, not even transitory for a year. Something like, transportation systems, airports, things of that sort that has high productivity that causes more business to come in and have some kind of payoff in perpetuity of higher income. And you better apply the criteria. If we're spending $1, we better get at least $1 worth of income back. And we're not even getting $1 worth of income back for every $1 we're spending. So we're in trouble. Basically, I think we've reached a tipping point where the income generation out of government spending has become a fraction of the government spending, which is all financed. So now we have less income, and that's right.
Feedback loop.
Well, the feedback loop is in Washington because they want more of it. But in any event, that's the big problem. And that's what I call the difference in this outline between the quantitative fiscal policy with the free lunch, number 6, the no free lunch quantitative fiscal policy. The no free lunch occurs when you got to finance it, and it cuts back other spending, it raises interest rates elsewhere, it creates the anticipation and the reality of more taxes, and it doesn't have a high enough payoff to pay for itself. So we're in the no free lunch. Now, as I say, in the United States, by the way, during World War II, we had a lot of massive fiscal spending on the war, and it worked because we didn't have the debt overhang that we have today. And we had high savings rate, which is exactly what's happening in China. China, it's effective because they're paying for that government debt out of past savings. So they're not having tax implications, and they're not having future debt service implications. they're ahead of the game, so they can afford it. And that's why fiscal policy is very effective there. It's not effective here. Look, what else can I tell you? Government spending went up by 1.4 trillion, and GDP fell by $1 trillion. Okay, so where are we getting? Just further and further behind the 8 ball. And if that continues, the market sees it, and this number continues to go off like a rocket. And if this number keeps going off like a rocket, you better start looking and investing somewhere else. In fact, you should have started looking for it yesterday, because the risk is too high, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, that is the debt-to-income consequences in sovereign risk. So I actually covered 7 as well. The debt-to-income consequences. When there are secondary offsets to government spending, it becomes a situation where you're in a perpetual increase in the debt-to-income ratio, and then you have sovereign risk enter the picture. So we're not getting a big enough payoff or bang for the buck for government spending. We're not getting any bang for the buck.